Welcome to the video recording of Racism, Costs for Everyone, and Ways to Prosper Together. This workshop, held on March 13, 2022, was the fifth in a series on systemic racism presented by Interfaith Communities for Dialogue. It opens with greetings from ICD Vice Chair Marie Monson.
Thank you, Judith, and good afternoon. Our ICD Chair, 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐬𝐿, will be joining us later, but it's my pleasure to stand in for him and offer a welcome and brief introduction to the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue, or ICD. Could we see slide number 3? Yeah. ICD is a network of faith-based and associated organizations dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and positive relationships among diverse people in and around Fairfax County through education, engagement, and support. It was founded 18 years ago by representatives of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faiths. As you can see from the slide, the membership now includes 11 organizations and faiths and representing 6 faiths. We promote inclusiveness, integrity, respect, and trust of all peoples. And we stand in unity with and support of each other. One way that we can do this is through the kind of workshop or dialogues that we've got today. Now I'd like to introduce Mary Beth Lee, who's a member of the ICD board and also of the working group that worked on this workshop. Mary Lee, she will introduce and moderate the program. Mary Beth, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Marie. Good afternoon and welcome to our 5th workshop on racism. From October 2020 to March 2021, ICD held 4 workshops on racism aimed at understanding better what racism is. In particular, promoting an awareness of how racism is built into the systems that govern our lives. We examined how systemic racism in areas such as health, education, housing, continue to disadvantage people, Black and Brown people. And we learned about some of the efforts to address those inequities. Today, we want to look at how the racism that's embedded in our systems and policies is costly to all of us, regardless of color or other differences, and consider some alternate ways forward. We will begin by viewing a TED Talk by 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐬𝐿. She's an economist and the author of the book, The Sum of Us. And I think you'll find her to be a very engaging speaker. Then Karla Bruce, who spoke at our last workshop, has graciously agreed to join us again today. She is the Chief Equity Officer for Fairfax County, responsible for providing overall management of the One Fairfax strategic framework that has been created to achieve equitable opportunity for all Fairfax County residents. Following her presentation, we'll briefly review some of the highlights from the 2 presentations today and from our previous workshops. And then we'll break into small groups where you'll be able to engage in conversation centered around a few questions that we will present later. At the end, we'll engage Ms. Bruce further in discussion based on your comments and questions. So let's get started. Here's 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐬𝐿.
Please pause this video and click on the link below to watch the 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐬𝐿 TED Talk. Then return to the video and continue the program. Thank you.
𝐏𝐿's talk demonstrates the value of working together to create a better community for all. It's what she refers to in her works as solidarity dividends. That is, uniting across racial and social lines for the benefit of all. We'll turn now to Karla Bruce to expand on this idea and bring it closer to home. Karla?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me again. As I shared with the organizers, I'm really excited to know that these types of conversations are happening in our community. The last time I participated in one of these sessions, I talked a lot about what was happening inside government to advance equity. But this idea that the reason for equity is not just to help the folks who are most directly impacted by inequity, but that there's this concept, again, what 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝 calls the solidarity dividend, that we actually all do better when we all do better. That's the county's tagline, actually, for One Fairfax. So again, I'm pleased to be here this afternoon and have a few slides to share with you, and then look forward to later being able to engage in conversation with you. Next slide. So just to refresh your memory, perhaps if you participated in the previous session, and to introduce to some of you sort of why One Fairfax. So it's because there's an uneven opportunity landscape in Fairfax County. So we see from several reports, both county data and data and analysis from private institutions, that there's extreme variances in opportunity and vulnerability within and across Fairfax County, and more broadly, Northern Virginia, and in fact, the whole metropolitan Washington region. But concentrating just on Fairfax, this map highlights a number of yellow areas in the county. And it comes from a report called the Getting Ahead report, the Uneven Opportunity Landscape in Northern Virginia, that was supported by the Northern Virginia Health Foundation in an effort to better understand the basis of health inequities, and conducted by the Center on Society and Health at Virginia Commonwealth University. This report calls these areas, quote unquote, islands of disadvantage. I will always say that I don't really like that terminology, but the point is that in these areas, there are likely to be barriers or lack of opportunity to the things that everyone needs to succeed and thrive. So that is access to well-paying jobs, access to better educational opportunities, access to quality and affordable childcare. And what we also see in these areas is that there are higher concentrations of people of color. And it really helps us to understand that, you know, the basis of inequity in Fairfax is really based in our systems and structures, and frankly, how we as a county are organized geographically. So when we look at the strategies that are going to help us to overcome that inequity, overcome structural racism in Fairfax County, we have to be place-based and system-focused, meaning the systems that have produced these spatial inequities. Because what we find is that when you look at all of those inequities, they've really served to constrain opportunity across the county. And that if we want to overcome inequity, our focus really has to be on promoting economic mobility. Next slide. So again, just as a reminder, in Fairfax County, we recognize this uneven opportunity landscape. And back in July of 2016, our Board of Supervisors and School Board adopted the One Fairfax resolution, which acknowledged that inequity exists in Fairfax. And then it directed that there be a policy developed. And so in November of 2017, the board and school board adopted the One Fairfax policy. And at its core, what it does is it directs that in the county government and in our school systems that we'll consider equity intentionally when we're making policies and when we're planning and delivering programs and services. So my role in the county government is to support the implementation of that policy and to track how we're doing and to sort of course correct as we see that our policies and practices are continuing to perpetuate inequities. I should note that on the school system side, there's also a chief equity officer. And so that person focuses specifically on the school system. But the purpose of One Fairfax, yes, it's a policy, but we really look at it as a way to begin to govern and manage in Fairfax County in ways that advance equity. Now, in order to do that, we do that based on a set of principles. First and foremost, we have to acknowledge history, right? So we can see inequity present in today, in present through our sort of the way that we look currently at life indicators, but we realize that how we got to our current reality is through a history of policies and practices that produced our current conditions. Now, given that history, we want to compare where we are now to what we want for the future and be willing to make choices, right? And establish clear priorities that would ensure that the inequities we see perpetuated today do not continue into our future. That will mean making bold and innovative policy choices in order to sort of change our trajectory. So, of course, Fairfax County is a great place to live, learn, work, and play, right? So we know, our economy, especially comparatively speaking, is booming, right? So things are going well in Fairfax County, but I just think that there's a few things we want to note. So there's a major demographic shift happening in Fairfax County. So yes, we're growing, and since 1980, the population has more than doubled. And at the same time, our population has become very diverse. And it's predicted that in 2044, and maybe given the most recent census, probably even sooner than that, when the nation is projected to become a majority people of color nation, Fairfax County by that time will be a county where over 70% of the population will be people of color. Now, what's notable in that number is that youth are really at the forefront of the county's changing demographics. So when you look at the population growth, Fairfax County's youth is much more diverse than its older population. And that I'm sure would make sense. But this racial generation gap is something that we should be paying attention to, because typically when you see these types of generational gaps, they come along with lower investments in educational systems and lower investments in community infrastructures that are necessary to support the younger and more diverse population. So I present that as the sort of first key challenge in this whole idea of the solidarity dividend, or this idea that we have embraced: we all do better when we all do better. So as we think about our future and acknowledge that we do have a very strong economy, what we have to focus, though, on is more equitable growth, right? Because our future prosperity is not going to be able to follow the same sort of strategy as our current economy follows, given the changes in our demographics. When we look at sort of where our economy is growing, and again, this is really a sign of strength, but it's really growing at the level where for high wage earners, and they are, so those jobs are growing. But when you look at the economy around medium and low wage workers, those groups are really being constrained. And then what we're seeing is a shrinking middle class and, this sort of widening of the sort of racial income or racial wealth gap. So again, something else from a policy perspective, and something that we hope our community can understand as an impact of our changing demographics and changing economy. So again, these trends, while we could embrace them and should embrace them as strengths, could also be a barrier if we don't think strategically and again, adopt more bold and innovative approaches to adapt to our changing situation. So we have to overcome these educational barriers for marginalized groups, all right? So we know that depending on who you are and where you are in Fairfax County, you're likely, for the strength of our school system, you're likely to have a different educational experience depending on the school you attend and the neighborhood that that school is in. Again, the idea that our middle and lower classes are being squeezed, we know that a strong middle class is the foundation of a strong economy. But if we are really seeing that it's becoming harder to live here or to afford to live here, what we're seeing is that it's harder for the middle class. And again, that middle and lower class folks are the people that sort of do many of the jobs that are essential for all of us in the county. That again is producing racial economic gaps. And again, people who are, people of color tend to earn less in general, and they are much more likely to be in these jobs that aren't sort of seeing the increases in opportunity. So that's something, again, that we want to focus on. And then again, from the perspective of our educational system, while we have a fairly low dropout rate in Fairfax County, about 9,200 youth in our community are disconnected, right? So I just want to point out a sort of few of the challenges that we're facing as a county when we sort of look at it from this perspective of the solidarity dividend and realizing how these differences might impact us all. So the key, we think, to advancing inequity in the county is really tackling this uneven geography of opportunity and prosperity. Next slide. So One Fairfax is a racial and social equity policy, and we use this terminology, equity, and I just want to spend a minute just to make sure everyone is on the same page about what that means. So we believe that equity is fairness, not sameness. Equity is a term often used interchangeably with equality, but what our focus is on is not giving everybody the same thing, right? It's also not focused on the inherent differences in people. What we're focusing on is that it's not people's lack that's preventing them from participating in our economy. It's an unjust and uneven system and structure, and that our policy and practice in government and the policy and practice of the other institutions that drive our economy is really important, that we focus on that uneven opportunity landscape. Next slide. And these changes, I mean, these differences are really grounded in the idea of race. And what we spoke about in our previous session, and what I want to continue to emphasize, is that while individual acts of racism are critical to address, at this level, when we're focusing at the system level, what we really want to emphasize is racism as it perpetuates itself at the institutional level, and racism as it perpetuates itself at the structural level. So policies and practices within organizations or sectors that perpetuate oppression has to be our focus. Again, within government and within the other institutions that create the conditions that exist in our community. And when those institutions come together to form structures, right? And again, whether, that's our housing policy, with transportation policy, with economic policies, those tend to form structures. And we have to look at how those systems are coming together to create barriers to opportunity. Next slide. We know that this is not unique to Fairfax, and we know that our history at the local level and the state level and the federal level has really served to create these barriers. And so that's why the historical perspective is very important. Yes, we want to start from where we are today and understand our situation, but we also want to think back over time at when policy was created and what was the sort of prevailing sentiment in our country, in our community at the time when policies were initially created. Because if we can figure out sort of what that sentiment was, we can sometimes detect when policies, whether with intention or without, were having the outcome of perpetuating inequity. So we know that, you know, the most obvious, or one of the most obvious reflections of the government's role in initially that's really explicit production of racial inequity is slavery, and the role that slavery played in producing our current economy. We can point to the internment of the Japanese population during World War II. We can look to the separation of indigenous people from their native lands at the settling of our country. So there are many, many examples of the explicit perpetuation of racial inequity. But we have to, you know, so while discrimination over time became illegal, the sentiment in the policies really continued to perpetuate inequity, right? So things that were sort of race neutral, while race wasn't named in the policy, the function of the policy still served to perpetuate inequity. So where we find ourselves now as a government is really seeking to better understand sort of how that happened and when that happened, and in what systems primarily do we see that, and how we can now proactively adopt policies and practices that advance racial equity. Next slide. And so as Fairfax County government, you know, we're looking at this at a strategic level across all systems and functions of the county government, with a focus on ensuring that all neighborhoods and all populations of Fairfax have the opportunity to live to their fullest potential. We think of this idea as having communities of opportunity, that we shouldn't see that uneven opportunity landscape in Fairfax County, and we're working strategically, utilizing our county-wide strategic plan. And I should point out that this is the first county strategic plan. And so if you're not strategic about working to ensure you know, structural racism isn't functioning, then you can, in fact, continue to promote it. So the fact that we didn't have a strategic plan didn't allow us, in many cases, to see these impacts over time. And so this strategic plan is allowing us to be intentional in our application of the One Fairfax policy. Next slide. And I think the grounding principle of our strategic plan, and one I hope to leave you all with, because I think it has relevance in our broader community, is this idea of targeted universalism. So we have broad goals that we want to achieve for Fairfax County. And again, I'll say Fairfax County overall is a great place to live, learn, work, and play. And that, you know, as we set goals to continue what we think is success for Fairfax County, we just have to acknowledge that structural inequity exists, and that not all populations are positioned to be able to participate successfully into and enjoy sort of all that is available in Fairfax County. So structural inequity exists. So it exists at the population level, and it exists at the sort of spatial or neighborhood or community level. And so our focus can't just be on setting broad goals for ourselves. Our focus has to be on acknowledging that structural inequity and really intentionally building opportunity structures that are supported not just by strategy, but by resources that are very much targeted, not in a one-size-fits-all way, but more in an intentional, targeted way to build these, you know, ladders of opportunity to achieve the various goals that we think are necessary for our community. Next slide. And just as an example of what we mean by opportunity, we're talking education. Of course, we're talking economy. We're talking mobility or transportation, access to healthy food, recreation and culture, housing, health. One of the things I want to point out, and I think the pandemic really served to help us to understand the lack of access from a digital perspective. When our children had to go home and be educated from a home, we got to see who lacked access to the internet. We got to see who lacked access to devices. We also got to see who had jobs that were the type of jobs that you could work from home, right? Because many of our people, our residents, were in jobs that forced them to not be able to isolate and to put themselves at risk of attracting COVID. And so, you know, I think the experience of the pandemic really illuminated where inequity existed in our county, and hopefully through the investment of some of our local and federal dollars, we have been able to make some intentional investments to overcoming that inequity. Next slide. And so just in general, sort of, how do we think about these opportunities, you know, that list of opportunities? And that's not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it's representative of things that you all would recognize as things that have been helpful to you in living your lives fully as residents of Fairfax County. So when we think about opportunity, we want to think about it in a spatial way. And we want to think about it, you know, sort of, is it available in Fairfax County to different populations, and where is it available? So we think about it, and we use geospatial resources to get a sense of vulnerability and opportunity. Now, where opportunity doesn't exist, our goal should be to build it, right? So one of the obvious ways that you might think about it is, you know, if affordable housing isn't available in certain locations, where can we build it? So one of the places that affordable housing isn't available is in the Tysons area, right? And the Tysons area is a major driver of our economy right now. So a county's targeted strategy is to bring housing affordability to that area. Another way to think about it is sometimes opportunity does exist, but there are barriers that, you know, sort of serve to separate people from the opportunity. So where can we work to make sure that people are connected to the opportunities that exist? So the digital access work that I mentioned earlier is one example of, we have, you know, when we think about broadband access is generally sort of from an infrastructure perspective available in Fairfax County, especially when you think of Fairfax County compared to more rural places. But is it affordable, right? Do people have devices in order to be able to utilize the broadband access that is available? So that's an example of connecting people to opportunity where it might already exist. And, you know, the idea that all of these opportunities fit together in a puzzle piece, as puzzle pieces, because what they do in isolation, yes, they are important, but they enable people to participate in an inclusive economy, right? And so we want a strong economy, and we want to continue to implement strategies that are going to strengthen that economy, but we want to ensure that it's inclusive in things like childcare, things like digital access, things like transportation, things like education. Those things enable a more inclusive economy. Next slide. And that is important from inside government perspective, right? So we need to be implementing policies that support that, but it's also important from an outside government perspective, because it's those outside of government, people like you, who can give us a better understanding of how the doors of opportunity have been opened or closed to different populations or different areas, and what's at the core, what's driving the lack of opportunity. It also helps to have a community that holds as a shared value that we all want. We want everyone in our community to be able to fully participate. Again, that holds as a shared value that we all do better when we all do better. And if we work with the community and, like I said, our other institutional stakeholders to co-create solutions and hold ourselves jointly accountable for making progress, that's how we will become a more equitable Fairfax County. Next slide. So I'll leave you with the idea that community action, not just the policy action that's happening and within the county, that is significantly important. And I hope you all feel proud to be a part of a community that has taken this type of policy action, but it also requires action at the community level. It requires doing what you're doing now, strengthening your own individual knowledge and skills, and doing it more broadly to promote that education and understanding across the community. Where you are a part of institutions, embedding these notions and concepts across your staff and volunteers, and looking at how your organizational practices might be changed to foster more equitable outcomes. We recognize that in government, we can't do it alone, but also in community, we're stronger when we work in coalitions, in networks, and when we mobilize the people most directly impacted by the inequity that we see. And again, when I talk about the people most directly impacted, it's both the people who are, who we could say live in the islands of disadvantage, who struggle to have success in each of those areas of opportunity. But hopefully everyone sees that they're impacted when everyone isn't able to fully participate in our economy. And everybody in our county is more mobilized to make that something that we support, and that what we're supporting it as, we're supporting it through a pro-equity policy and a pro-equity legislative agenda. So holding us accountable at the local level, but also looking at what's driving state policy in practice, and what's driving federal policy in practice, and how we can influence those things to, again, create the local conditions for a more equitable Fairfax County. Next slide. So I'll serve again, because I believe you all to be a group that is seeking to learn and to be active. I share with you this link, or this last slide, that has links to different reports and other resources that dig more deeply into some of the concepts that I just shared with you. I know we don't have that much time, but hopefully serve as a resource to give you a better sense of where you all fit into making Fairfax County become one Fairfax. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karla. I love the tagline, "We all do better when we all do better." Before we send you off into small groups, we want to take a few moments to review some of the things that we've learned. If you participated in the previous ICD workshops, you'll recall that racism is a social construct. That means that it's not based in biology, that racism is learned attitudes and behaviors. And it's also a tool that's been used to exercise power. The historical roots of systemic racism are deep, going back to the origins of our country. At the structural or institutional level, this leads to differential access to services and disparities in experiences and opportunities. And as a result, human resources and talents are being wasted. In her TED Talk, 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝 showed how societal racism also harms those we expect to benefit from privilege. She talked about Gary, whose prejudice caused him to experience fear, anxiety, and isolation, and in his own words, kept him from being a better American. Economic harm also comes to us from racist policies. This is seen in the underinvestment in public goods and sometimes the destruction of public goods, as in her example of the pool. Racism was a key factor in the 2008 financial crisis, which led to huge loss of wealth, jobs, and a reduction in the home ownership rate. And it was not only in Black and brown communities. Racism and zero-sum thinking, what's good for one group has to come at the expense of another, caused some people to act against their own best interests, as was seen in the union organizing efforts. On the other hand, McGee showed how teamwork can lead to revitalization of a community, increased tax revenues, and economic growth, as in Lewiston, Maine. This is an example of her solidarity dividends, and she advocates that that should be our goal. She concludes that zero-sum thinking yields bad policy. Contrary to the belief that what's good for one group has to come at the expense of another, she proposes that an injury to one is an injury to all, and that racism is bad for everyone. Finally, we've just heard Karla Bruce discuss the uneven opportunity landscape in Fairfax County. The one Fairfax philosophy guides us to face our history honestly and to consider what we want for our future. We need to set priorities and make choices based on social and racial equity and be bold and innovative in our approaches. She urges us to understand that equality is not the same as equity, and has talked about how targeted universalism can be a mechanism by which we can foster progress towards equity. In addition, she encouraged us all to be involved in community action. That's a lot of food for thought and for conversation, which is what we will move to now. As we do so, please keep in mind a few ground rules for active listening and participation. Keep your mind open to other perspectives. Accept others for where they are. Be curious. Enjoy the discovery of new ideas. Speak with sincerity, and keep your comments brief to allow everyone the opportunity to participate. The questions that will frame the group discussion are these. What is your view of the zero-sum concept? How have policies and practices which excluded targeted groups affected you? Describe your vision of an equitable future. And what role do you see for faith communities in overcoming zero-sum thinking and systemic racism? Welcome back. I hope you all had great conversations and that the reporters are ready to share just a few brief comments from your groups. I'll ask the reporters to raise their hand, use that function. If you're not familiar with it, at the bottom of your screen, there's a reaction button. If you click on that, then there's a raised hand and you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. But I'd also like to remind you that after we have these reports, that we'll also have a time where we'll be engaging with Karla Bruce. And so if you have any questions or comments for her, please put them in the chat line. Okay, 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝, is that correct? Can you share with us what your group?
All righty. Thank you very much. I was having trouble getting my unmute done. We were in the fourth breakout group. I think Waleed was an excellent facilitator. I will say that we had a very intense but healthy dialogue. Unfortunately, we only got to 3 out of the 4 questions, but that's all right. But basically, much of our conversation focused upon the intersectionality of various inequities and forms of injustice. And no matter what the injustice is, whether it's racism or any other form of injustice or inequity that's interconnected, it's imperative that we are intentional about helping people to see that they're structural, systemic, and institutional.
Thank you so much. Asamini?
Yeah, so I think we had, great dialogue around the different questions. Some of the highlights in our group was around, I think we talked about the zero-sum game concept and how a lot of us agreed that we're all diminished. If we have that sort of framework, we end up moving backwards, and we, think that there's more progress if we don't have that viewpoint about zero sum. And a lot of the interesting comments came around, the vision around equitable future. I think some of the highlights are like in the education space, if everyone could have, if there's schools or that are inequitable, that don't have the resources to be able to get them access so that there's equity there, even in the public health space, with being covered by health insurance. We got into some of the law enforcement topics as well. And the fact that, on the police in Fairfax County and policing, there's a lot being done around implicit bias and like making sure that some of the law enforcement officers are understanding their bias and how they police and understanding the data around that so that there's equitable future there, because that's also talking about the pipeline into, the jails and things like
Well, the
that, like
prison
making sure to,
pipeline.
right, making sure to address that as well. And I think from our faith-based perspective, a lot of what we talked about in terms of how as a faith community we can impact equity is just looking within ourselves too, in our different faiths, like how we can be welcoming to all different races. We talked about like, some churches might, be more, white churches versus Black churches, and like the different spaces, even, in mosques or synagogues, like looking at how we can welcome diversity within our own faith-based communities and begin that dialogue there too, continue that dialogue that we're doing here at ICD, and then ultimately impact things down the line with equity elsewhere, if we have to start from within ourselves as well. So some points there.
Great, a lot of good points there. Thank you.
Mhm.
Virginia Bridges?
So we had a good conversation too, I think. When we talked about the zero-sum concept, we talked about how more group decisions take longer, but the greater the diversity of the group, the more likely you are to get interesting ideas and novel solutions for problems. We talked about that all of us had experienced some form of discrimination where we were kept from doing something that we wanted to do based on other people's perception of us, that was inaccurate. For instance, if you wanted to march in a protest march and you were the wrong religion or the wrong nationality, you weren't accepted. So that kind of thing. And if you wanted a specific job or internship possibility, you might be assigned to a lesser one, depending upon your background. And then we combined the last, all of our faith traditions are working actively to try to dismantle racism and understand these concepts. But what we could do is to be a bridge people who can help faith groups understand these concepts and expand diversity. Okay.
I like that term, bridge people. That's good. Thank you, Virginia. Geneva?
Our group discussed as far as the pie being finite. I mean, being only so much of it, that although the pie might seem finite, it's really as large as it can be made. We talked about how it's up to those who are responsible for inequities to keep on making intentional efforts until we see results. One vision of an equitable future is helping cultivate the talents of all, making one humanity a goal, and developing intentional plans to bring people together, advocate for policies that target inequity. I think that's about it.
Thank you, Geneva. Were there any other groups to report? I don't see any more hands raised. Or Claire?
We talked about the importance of being aware of the resources of our community, and particularly we talked about from the last seminar that we were at, they talked a lot about the Route 1 corridor. So we referred back to that and ways to help the inequity there. And we focused mainly on the school system and different ways that we can do that. And it seems like the various churches that are involved and our synagogue have been very aware of inequities and done various volunteer activities in terms of the school system, whether it's reading, mentoring, citizenship, ESL, collecting sandwiches for the weekend. There's an Appalachian project that I think Calvin Klein does to help people in the community, and just various ways that we can physically do something and be aware of what's needed in our community and make ourselves resourceful in that way.
Great, thank you. Robert Terzian?
Yes,
Do you have your hand raised?
Yes. Tabitha was our leader in group 6. We had a fairly uniform agreement that we were not bought. We bought the idea that that the zero-sum game false and not helpful, and that our goal ought to be different. We identified a number of problems that we saw. The housing inequities, we talked about the Route 1 issue, which seems to be the result of past discrimination, although when we spoke about how we thought we might individually have been the product of such invidious actions, most of us did not particularly feel that we had personal experience. We talked about the desire for people to live pretty much the way we think we do, that everybody's opportunities need to be recognized and supported, their goals, their objectives. We discussed the need to be involved in the local community as perhaps the beginning place for work. The statement "charity begins at home" was made, which I think is at home is very important. And then we branch out to our church, our local government, our local civic organizations to become more actively involved. And that we felt like our churches were engaged in activities already. Perhaps there are more, but that pretty well summarized, I think, the way our discussion group went.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. A lot of good input from all of the groups. And I'm not seeing that there are any more. So then I am going to turn the floor over to Adina Friedman. She is a professor of conflict resolution and a friend of ICD. And she and Karla Bruce will be having a discussion centered around questions that have been submitted. So if you have any questions that you would like to be considered, please put them in the chat box. Over to you, Adina.
Okay, hi Hi, everybody. So while the rest of you are thinking of some more questions, I'll start with what I have. And one question I have here is, we all seem, easily convinced that the zero sum is not the best framework, but what about all those people out there who do see the world in zero sum terms? How can we, mostly because they're afraid of losing something if it were different, how would we be able to reach those kinds of people?
Well, let me first start by saying, these conversations are really important and hopefully are enabling and empowering people to feel confident to have conversations with their families and neighbors. There's not, a prescriptive way to do this, right? This is a way of changing a way of thinking. But one of the things that I think is important is to help people to, provide people with evidence, right? So there's a lot of, some people are motivated by the moral reasons to advance equity, but some people need to see how specifically it would support them. So in our small group, one of the things that we talked about is the very nature of how Fairfax County is organized. And one of the groups spoke about the Richmond Highway corridor and, doing things that support people living along the Richmond Highway corridor. Well, one of the things that is challenging along the Richmond Highway corridor, well, two things. One is there's a very high density of low-income housing along the Richmond Highway corridor. That's because that type of housing isn't able to be built in other parts of the county, right? And so when you have that type of concentration in one area, it produces certain outcomes. So when, so pointing out sort of the evidence of the challenge, I think is sort of one way that we can begin to help people to understand its broader impact. I would absolutely agree that, programs and services and things to help the population that sort of reside along that corridor, and not just the Richmond Highway corridor. I think there's sort of a crescent where you see this higher density of low-income housing and higher density of people of color. But when you recognize sort of what's producing that, and that's because, that type of housing isn't available or can't be available in other areas of the county, and thereby, it blocks people from opportunity. So evidence, I think, is really key.
So a follow-up question to that. In some cases, what's missing from what people need in order to change their mind or to see things differently is evidence and data. But in many cases, they need that change of heart before they're willing to even access that kind of information. So what do you think about the change of heart part? Because again, it's not like it's only a cognitive process. People have biases that are not based on just information. So how would we go about engaging them for that change of heart?
Yeah, I think it's relationships, and I think it's humanity, right? And I think it's about people coming to know and understand, what I think for the most part is everybody's inherent desire to support themselves, contributing in meaningful ways to the community and be good neighbors. If you're not in proximity or in relationship with people who aren't like you, it makes it, I think people can lose their sort of sense of the humanity of the other. One of the leading professors or leading authorities in this work is Professor John Powell, who's at UC Berkeley. And he has a concept called othering and belonging, and that we as a society have many ways that we can other people, right? And sort of find ways that people are different. And he really promotes the idea of creating belonging and figuring out how to introduce people with differences into your circle of concern. There's not sufficient time today to go into it, but that would definitely be something I would suggest looking into. He is also behind the concept that I did share with you, this idea of targeted universalism. And I think the othering and belonging concept and targeted universalism are two key concepts that can help people to, again, beyond the data, like, so targeted universalism is the data. I think the othering and belonging piece is the piece that helps people to build understanding and relationship across differences. I apologize for the
I think
noise in
that's
the back room. It's a Sunday afternoon and my daughter is moving around. So if you didn't hear that last piece, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that answer goes also to part of our answers to questions 3 and 4 from before, and how we can be an asset to one another in bringing about that kind of change. But let me go to another question here. So how is our governor's push to remove the term equity from everything impacting Fairfax County and One Fairfax?
But one thing I will say, and again, working on the executive side and not the political side, I feel fortunate to have a board of supervisors that continues to stand behind our commitment to advance One Fairfax beyond sort of what's happening at the state level. I do think, particularly for our school system, that certain state policies are really restricting their ability to teach and their ability to serve. And I think that that's something that can be monitored. But more broadly, in terms of our policy, we have a board of supervisors that, regardless of the change, and I will point out that Fairfax County was well on this journey before the previous administration. So this is something that we recognized as critical to the future of One Fairfax, or the future of Fairfax. And so remain wholeheartedly committed even with the changes. That being said, though, it is concerning to see some of the legislative changes that are happening at the state level, particularly as it relates to what is able to be taught in the schools and how there can be differences. And again, this idea of targeted universalism, how the school is able to target and adjust their strategies to be in response to structural inequities that exist.
Yeah, I would say that kind of stuff, again, this all connects. So that relates to the question about how do we connect with people who do believe zero sum is the way to go. And usually those are the people who benefit from the system, of course, not the ones who don't. So it still remains that same challenge of getting the point across, not only getting the point across, but actually getting the buy-in from, because maybe they get the point and they just don't want to lose privilege, but getting the point across, getting the buy-in from those elements that are more difficult. I think we're done with questions, unless anybody else has a last question.
If I could just quickly add, and again, there isn't enough time to go into it, but I would just encourage, and I will see if I can find a resource to share. As you engage in conversations with people who hold opposing views, one of the strategies that we teach is this idea of affirm, counter, and transform. Affirm, meaning that as you hear something, right, that zero-sum game, is the right way to go, you affirm that people believe what they believe, right? So I think often we're encouraged to just reject an idea, and it puts us in this situation of, just kind of going back and forth and never changing people's minds. But where I think it's most helpful to start is you affirm people have a reason why they believe what they believe, right? You don't want to, take away from the fact that their reasons are grounded in something. what you then do is offer a counter, something else for them to be grounded in, right? So if you know what their ideas are grounded in, and you can offer something that counters what their ideas are grounded in, and then give them a pathway for continued learning. That's the transform piece, right? Because these are not one-off conversations that are going to change people's hearts and minds and actions. This is really sort of committing people to engage in a journey. So a group called Race Forward came up with this narrative shifting framework of affirm, counter, and transform, which I think is helpful for folks who are on this journey, engaging with others who they are trying to place on the journey. But I think the most important takeaway is, with that is to affirm people's beliefs, right? Not to agree with them, right? You don't necessarily agree with them, but you recognize that their beliefs are grounded in history or experience or something. And then based on that, figure out what you can do that would help them to choose another place to be grounded, and then offer them sort of a pathway forward.
Okay, so meanwhile, you're not done yet because we have another 2 questions.
Okay.
But I'll combine them. So basically, are there any examples of success stories where zero-sum approach was the approach? Like, has zero-sum worked? But I guess we would have to define what does that mean, worked, and for whom, but has it worked? And this question, I'm not sure I'm understanding correctly, but how do we get across in a winner take all to do with zero sum? So I guess that maybe I'm understanding that in a society or world or context where winner take all is the mindset, how do we do away with zero sum? Am I understanding that correctly? I hope. Anyway, so those are.
So I'm not quite understanding what the question is. Like, is the zero sum work in some sense? And I haven't done research to see where it has worked. My experience is that it does not work. I think, there are examples that I can point to that would illustrate that it doesn't work. I think, where you started with the talk by Heather McGhee definitely shared examples of where zero sum doesn't work. But one of the things that I would say, and it gets back to my opening remarks, is, the changing nature of Fairfax County. One, the population has grown significantly, and 2, it has diversified. So one, it's evidence that the economy grew, right? It didn't stay as one type of economy. It grew and enabled more people to be able to participate in it. And that's a good thing, right? Now we can pause and take a look at who is participating in that economy and in what ways, and invite more who are facing barriers. And again, one of those barriers is something we talked about, or I shared in my opening remarks, is, there's this widening wealth gap, right? And so most of the jobs that are expanding Fairfax County's economy are at the higher end. And so what could be done to invite people in the middle and lower end to be able to be successful in our economy? That has to be intentional. So one of the things, and it gets to this example that we were talking about earlier around Richmond Highway. So one of the members of the board of supervisors, Supervisor Rodney Lusk, who is the supervisor for the Lee District, is working with on developing what he is calling an innovation center along the Richmond Highway corridor. So it's not just serving, what I've heard people talk about working to serve poverty that versus ending poverty, it's working, it's not just serving, it's not just saying, okay, you're poor and I'm going to give you food, or you're poor and I'm going to help you pay your rent. It is helping people to gain the skills in order to be able to improve their situation, right? And so I think it's those types of strategies that really show how we can begin to diversify our economy, not just in terms of the complexion of the people who are in it, but in terms of the opportunities to participate in it and where those are available. So that's one, I'm hoping, tangible example of where the pie can be expanded, right? The pie doesn't stay the same. We already have evidence as Fairfax changed from a sort of rural community to a suburban community and an economy that sort of grew based on our connection to government and industry as an industry. We can further change it, right? There are other things that we can continue to do, and in doing those other things, that'll invite other people to be able to participate in that economy.
I think some of these questions exemplify a dilemma I have. I'm preparing a presentation for Friday for some academic get together, and I'm talking about women's inclusion in peace processes. And it's again back and forth between, do I need to focus on the evidence to convince the powers that be, who are usually men, that why it's beneficial to have women? Or should I also say that that's supposed to be the ethos, that why do we need to advocate that it's beneficial? Why should that be the only argument and not that it's the right thing to do because we're part of the population? So it's kind of the same, like you have to show evidence that it works, that inclusion works and is beneficial, but it also has to be probably coupled with some other kinds of arguments that are targeting the heart and the being true to your ethos, as opposed to, okay, if you really insist on being a racist, white supremacist, whatever society, then there's nothing further to argue really. But if you think that it's something else, anyway, okay, so I think that we are done with the questions for now. Hopefully we'll have future opportunities for more conversations. And again, hopefully this is just part of a longer process, not the beginning and not the end. So thank you, Karla, very much. And I'm turning and thank everybody else for participating too. I'm turning it over to Marie to conclude.
Thank you very much. I think this has been an excellent program. And I particularly want to thank Karla for being our key speaker, and also for the opportunity we've had to continue learning from you, Karla, about what's going on in Fairfax County, and also giving us some tools to go beyond the macro situation. I'd also like to thank Adina for leading the Q&A and facilitating all the group discussions. We're thankful finally to Mary Beth Day, who did an excellent job as our moderator and who helped develop the webinar along with other members of ICD. And to each of you who attended and shared your ideas. This is an ongoing learning process for all of us. You'll be receiving it in a couple of days, a very brief survey. And we hope you'll respond, because we always learn from the feedback we get. So thank you again, and we hope you all have a good evening, and go and be bridge people.
To view other workshop videos in this series, click on the playlist button below. To subscribe to our channel and receive notifications of new videos, click on the subscribe button below.